Nice. Good to see you back again. We now are going to have a short discussion, just like about 45 minutes or stuff, where in the end, or not just in the end, anytime you're warmly invited to ask questions or to make your point, just give me a sign or scream if I don't see you. I am August Modersohn. I'm a journalist from Leipzig. I came here just for this evening, unfortunately, but because I have to go back tonight because I can't take the train, but that's not so important. More important is who's here. Joe Davis, you know him already. And on my right is Christina Brandt. Christina Brandt, she's a professor for history and philosophy of natural science, and you are the director of the Ernst Haeckel House here in Jena at the FSU. Nice to have you here. We also have Stefan Lorkowski. He's a professor for biochemistry and physiology of nutrition. I hope it's right. I just read it in the internet. Joe Davis, you know already. And we have also Hendrik Huthoff. He's the head of education at the Jena School for Microbial Communication. Nice to have you here. And the three of them, they also have prepared something to introduce themselves and their points of view. And I would like to start with you, Mr. Lorkowski. After that, I would ask you, Mr. Huthoff. You also brought your computer. And then Ms. Brandt. But it's up to you.
Yeah. So first of all, welcome and thank you very much for this invitation and the chance to meet with Joe Davis. And it was very inspiring to see the talk. In particular, because when I was a PhD student, I was very interested in DNA computing. Yeah, and I found it fascinating what we can do with DNA molecules to solve problems, at least in principle, that couldn't be solved by computers. So, for example, traveling salesman, yeah, it was a science publication. It was wonderful work, just with 8 cities as far as I remember, but it was the solution how to find the shortest way between 8 cities for a traveling man. And this was done by PCR, yeah, just a molecular biological tool, and showed that using 4 bits of information instead of 2 bits, we can calculate, and this is the basic for, today for quantum computing. Yeah? So it was very inspiring. And I saw these parallels when you encoded phrases or texts into the DNA. So beside arts, I think this is a very old question in science, how to encode information. And also I think the combination of science and art is quite important for me from another point of view, because for things like you do, I see 2 chances for science. So one is to transport knowledge. Yeah. So for me, it is quite important, and we have seen this during Corona, how important it is to translate scientific knowledge to the broader society, yeah? Because many people who have not the natural science basis do not understand what is happening now, why it is important to get vaccination and so on. So to transfer knowledge using art for a certain group of people, at least, who are interested in arts. And the second thing is that, yeah, since I started as a scientist in the end of the 90s, I was still working with a pen and painting schemes for my publications, and then we did it with PowerPoint, and we made photographs and so on. But today we have the possibility with high-resolution microscopy and other techniques to make science visible, yeah? To show how fascinating science is when you demonstrate how a virus looks like in a respective high-resolution microscope. And this fascination science can bring to people is important. And also, I think it's maybe also a kind of art how to visualize scientific data, which is getting more and more complex, even for us as a scientist. I read many papers and I don't understand what they are talking about, yeah, because they are omics data I cannot analyze myself. But if you have a good visualization of the data, and I think this is an art of itself, to visualize data and information so that it is understandable for other people, or easier to understand complex interactions and complex meanings.
If you're saying, Mr. Lorkowski, how fascinating science can be, I think it's a good point for you to start, Mr. Huthoff, because we can see it.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Great. So actually, it's a great point. So, hi, I'm Hendrik Huthoff, and I am the manager of the Jena School for Microbial Communications, and evidently I'm not very good with computers, because somebody told me this was going to work very easily, but it doesn't. So, I manage a graduate program in microbiology here at the Friedrich-Schiller University in Jena, and that is also part of the excellence cluster Balance of the Microverse. And this is a research effort to really understand what microbes are doing for us and with us, whether they live in the water, whether they live on plants, whether they live in humans. And so in the last year, we devised, or we thought, what can we do to really effectively communicate our science to the public? And we came up with this pretty crazy idea that I'm now trying to realize in collaboration with the Planetarium Jena, which is the oldest continuously operating planetarium in the world. We want to make a documentary film about the life of microbes in the planetarium. So this is a dome structure. You will be fully immersed into these microscopic images. And actually, we struck lucky straight away. On the first attempts of projecting the microscopic images in the planetarium, it turned out we didn't actually have to modify the images, because a microscopic image, unlike this one that you see, which has been cut to be square, an actual microscopic image, because of the lens, is actually round. So it fits perfectly onto the planetarium dome structure. And so what we want to do is to really take viewers on a journey into the world of microbes, and use moving images as well. I don't have film with me today, just some stills, but I hope to convince you with this short introduction that this is a fantastically fascinating world that we want to take the viewer on a journey into. And what I have learned, I think that ties in with the comments of the previous speaker, in the process of doing this is to turn scientists into storytelling is the difficult bit, because they will tell you, well, this is a very interesting cell, and in green is my favorite transporter molecule with such and such amino acid sequence. And I'm like, well, what's the story here? So trying to turn scientists into storytellers is my challenge at the moment. I think Joe Davis gave us a masterclass today, how you really can construct such a wonderful story as the one of the angel making today. So I will keep my my introduction brief, short. I'm a scientist trying to make a film, and I'm on a learning journey, and I find it fascinating.
No, it's up to you, Ms. Brandt.
Yes, thank you very much also for the invitation. And I didn't bring my computer, but I brought my paper. I'm from the Geisteswissenschaften, and I put my notices on paper still. So we were given 5 minutes to give a short statement in which we were asked to introduce ourselves. And I will use these 5 minutes, and since my two colleagues were much faster, maybe I need a little bit more than 5 minutes, I will use them for doing 3 things. First, I will start to explain how I came to this panel, although I am not an expert on bioarts, or arts in general, or even biology. I came to this panel, of course it was a chance to meet Joe Davis, but also because of the title of this arts and science project in Jena, namely the title of this event is a part of this project, and the title is Die Entstehung einer künstlerischen Tatsache, which is a reference to Ludwig Fleck. And Fleck is, of course, an important approach in my field, namely in history of science. So I'm a historian of science, and what I will discuss today is coming from this perspective, the perspective of history of science. Secondly, I will, with Fleck in the background, I will very briefly raise maybe very general questions about bioarts in the second part of my few minutes. And in the last minute, I will briefly go a little bit into my field, namely history of life sciences, especially in order to ask Joe Davis about how he sees his own role in historical developments, especially developments in molecular biology and informational sciences, yes, in the 1980s. So first, the title, Die Entstehung einer künstlerischen Tatsache, is of course a reference to Fleck's book, which was originally published in 1935, Entstehung und Entwicklung einer wissenschaftlichen Tatsache, Genesis and Development of a Scientific Fact. Fleck was himself a microbiologist, and he is today a classic reading in history of science and science studies. Why? Because Fleck argues that science is deeply a social endeavor, and we cannot understand the genesis and development of a scientific fact without looking at the dynamics within and between research communities. And moreover, the very notion of a scientific fact became challenged with Fleck's approach. He argued that a scientific fact is not a thing of a genius scientific discovery of an individual scientist, but instead the result of a long social process of production of knowledge. Scientific concepts or theories are therefore inherently shaped by cultural conditions. There is no meaning in itself, but a scientific concept gets its meaning in the broader context of shared cultural values and shared scientific ideas of a specific research community. So, with Fleck in the background, the creativity in sciences, the emergence of new knowledge, has to be understood as deeply rooted in the traveling and transfers of concepts and practices across borders, not only between different scientific disciplines, but also the borders between science, technology, culture, or we could put it, arts. These movements are very similar to what I learned from Joe Davis in a short movie about artistic creativity, where he explained his idea of creativity as, I quote, the ability to put things together in new ways. So, with that, I will come to our subject this evening. Framing the Arts and Science project here in Jena with the title Entstehung einer künstlerischen Tatsache includes, of course, an epistemological thesis, and a strong one, namely that arts and sciences are grounded in similar underlying processes, and that there might not be so much different, or that there are not so much differences between scientific and artistic creativity. So my questions to the artist here, but also the scientist, and especially to Joe Davis, are the following. Can artists and scientists be members of the same community or same thought style, to phrase it with Fleck's notion? What is the difference between a produced artistic fact and a scientific fact in the sense how Fleck used this term? Are there differences? Is there an artistic fact at all? How to understand the relationship between science and arts within the field of bioarts in particular? A fusion of science and arts, or even a visionary endeavor, similar to figures of artistic engineers of the Renaissance, an analogy that seems to be discussed a lot, as I learned from an interview with Ingeborg Reichle. Or, on the contrary, a critical play with tools and methods of gene technologies in order to critically understand the role of recent science in society in another way? What is the epistemic role of arts in this relationship, if there is an epistemic role at all? Or is bioart, to put it a little bit provocatively, only a fashionable and joyful way of practicing public understanding of sciences? So we heard about the needs for that, of course. But is this done with art or artistic approaches? But also the question, what is the role of science in this relationship? And how can science may be changed by these artistic approaches? The last questions, do approaches in bioart help to understand the shifts in the epistemic values of the 20th and 21st century life sciences, or does it rather superpose or even hide major ethical and social challenges that went along with the new biotechnologies? With this very strong last question, I will come to my last part. I call this last part metaphors of information and communication, because this is for me the framing of also the work of Joe Davis in some sense, or nature and culture and bioarts and life sciences. In my own historical approach, I worked a lot on the role of metaphors in science, especially on how the metaphors of a genetic code and genetic information entered biology in the 1950s. On a conceptual level, we find the transformation of biology into an information and then later computational sciences within the rise of molecular biology at that decade. And also what happened at that decade, we heard it today, the central dogma. This was a phrase Francis Crick coined in 1958. Yes, there was already a little bit the subtext of searching for the essence of life, to view the genetic code as the essence of life. This was already discussed at that time. From a historical perspective, this has to be understood in the very specific context of post-World War II and the rise of cybernetics. In the 1970s, with the beginnings of the recombinant DNA technologies, we have again a historical turn. With the newly arising gene technologies, the boundaries between nature and technology became blurred. And they became blurred in a by then unexpected dimension we had never had before. And of course, these developments were often, at least in Germany, extremely critically discussed by the public. Given the standard historical picture, I find it extremely interesting that Joe Davis started his first bioart projects as early as in the 1980s, within the historical context of an, on the one hand, enthusiastic scientific atmosphere of progress with this new science, yes, and on the other hand, a very critical social and ethical approach on gene technologies in Western societies. So, I'm wondering how Joe Davis would see himself or his role himself at that time in the 1980s within this field, namely by constructing synthetic molecules of DNA and inserting cultural graphics via these DNA code and language, so to speak, into the living objects. He turned the living material into a new digital medium. However, in my view, these early projects clearly symbolized, and very early on, that the new gene technologies not only blurred the boundaries between nature and technology, so we have a very new kind of biotechnology coming out of this, but maybe even more important, the boundaries between nature and culture. So biologists start to rewrite nature, and with this very, in my view, symbolic bioarts, where you encode cultural figures, cultural icons within the language of nature, of course, this blurring of this boundary becomes very obvious. However, almost 25 or 30 years later, in 2010, Craig Venter, for example, a pioneer in the human genome projects, but also a pioneer in synthetic biology, announced the building of a synthetic organism from scratch, as he framed that. And he and his group encoded also passages from literary texts and their own names into these newly designed synthetic genomes, calling them watermarks, so to speak. So I built this bridge from Joe Davis' early arts, so to speak, to Craig Venter, because I want to raise a couple of questions. So what is the role of bioarts in these developments of the life sciences? What becomes symbolized in this bioartistic approach by encoding cultural icons into the language of nature within these religious subtexts, so which was very dominant when we heard it today. So does bioart show something or put something to the foreground that is inherently in the scientific endeavor? Becomes the scientist, like Craig Venter, a kind of artist now, or even a creator to stay on with this religious metaphors? So I'm really curious to hear more about this from the scientist and the artist.
Craig Venter, I asked him a question. I asked him whether Watson's genome was bigger than his genome, or whether his genome was bigger than Watson's. And everybody laughed except Venter. He got really red in the face. Do you want me to try to answer your questions now?
Well, yeah, thank you, Ms. Brandt. This is pretty enormous. You got a list of strong questions, and your questions are way better than the ones I got here. So I would say we should just take yours. But, well, no, I just wrote down some of your questions, and maybe you can just keep in mind what you want to have answered by you. But I would just steal the first of your questions, if it's okay for you, because it was the provocative one. And it's up to you, Joe Davis. Is BioArts just a fashionable thing? What would you say?
Well, I have to say that it has become fashion. Like certain aspects of art and biology have become very fashionable, like opposition to GMO, like genomics. These topics have become fashionable outside of science and often without scientific literacy, right? But you know, I didn't originate the term bioart, and I don't really feel comfortable. What I feel comfortable being called is artist. That's pretty broad enough for me. Bioartist is. It's like if art is something like science, it's something unlike science. It's like quantum physics in that it has to describe the whole world, but you can't describe something that you choose to remain clueless about. I'm a big advocate of scientific literacy in the arts. I think it's incredibly important. I think art can contribute to scientific knowledge. But I don't think that's the principal driver. My blend of art and science, I think, is kind of Vitruvian. It's not really art, and it's not really science. It's something straddling both worlds. Vitruvius had it right way back when. He said, you know, an artist should know astronomy, and it should know how to draw, of course, but also natural philosophy, moral and ethical philosophy. He said we should know about mathematics to do figures. Try telling an artist he has to know arithmetic these days. He said we had to know about all of these things or we would never become perfect masters. And he anticipated your next question, which is, how can one mind contain all of this stuff?
I would not have asked that, but yeah.
He said, see, because everything is connected, if you just pay attention from the time you're a young person until that you will draw all these things together anyway, that those connections are obvious. And it takes real effort, on the other hand, to separate these things, to put on the blinders, to say, I study the parasites that appear in the tongues of a particular species of lizard. Okay, it's just that has to do with so many other things. It takes a real effort to stop. I think the brain has the capability of doing all of these things. In fact, I think there are places in the brain that are intentionally quantitative and intentionally qualitative, and we learn through our lives in school and in business to ignore, kind of reverse. What's it called?
The distinction is that no.
What's it called when one part of the brain takes over another part of the brain? One part of the brain gets
degeneracy?
Not autism. When one part of the brain gets injured and then another part of the brain takes over that job. Dyslexia. So what I'm saying is that we are, in general, we kind of enact this reverse dyslexia on ourselves to concentrate on like this particular thing, this particular, as if the rest of the universe slipped by.
Today, I had lunch with a colleague, and I told her that I would do this tonight, being at an arts and science residency and talk about arts and science. And she was like, arts and science? This is something that she could not bring together. Well, she's no artist, she's no scientist, she's a journalist. She doesn't have to do anything with science and nothing with arts. But then I had a phone call to you, Mr. Huthoff, and you said, well, actually it's the same, or it's pretty much similar. So what would you say to her?
So I really dislike those distinctions to say that art and science are inherently different things. And so let's make an example. When I say DNA, everybody in this room has got a visual idea of DNA.
DNS.
Sorry?
DNS.
DNS, auf Deutsch DNS, die Deoxyribonukleinsäure. We've all got a double helix idea. This is nothing to do with physical reality. This is a visual representation of that molecule of DNA. If you go into molecules, molecules are nothing but space. The further we look, we go into subatomic particles. They aren't actually these string-like structures. They are incredibly dynamic assemblies of subatomic particles that have an equilibrium that equates something that we present by two strands that we can conveniently rip apart and do cell division with. But that visual idea, the same is happening with COVID right now. Everybody in this room, I say COVID, you've got a picture of a virus in your head, but nobody ever has or will see with their eyes a virus. They are not visible with the eyes. And even if you go make a picture of it with electron microscopy, that is merely a map of penetration of electrons into a certain space or not. And I think nobody here really has a proper idea of what an electron really is. So even scientists live by these artistic representations of what we think is the physical world. So for me, that distinction, I was struck by the comment that you made, because I'm also not of the current generation of PhD students who make their publication figures on PowerPoint and such. We had an artist in residence in our department who made the figures for our scientific publications. Who drew
a scientific illustrator.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's not an artist.
All right, okay, well. So, over to you then, the difference between the illustration and the art.
You know, sometimes when new postdocs join our lab or whatever, they'll get introduced to me and they'll go, "Oh well, you can illustrate by,"
Right. Okay.
or
yeah,
you know, I mean, occasionally, but that's not what I'm there for. But I've done a few covers, you know, as a favor, but that isn't what I do, right? Yeah.
Maybe I want to add again, of course, the importance of visual representation in sciences is of course clear, and we have this tradition going back to the 18th century and even earlier, and especially with respect to the success of the DNA model, the visual representation of the DNA was very, very crucial in the 1950s and early 1960s. But the question remains, so is even an artistic visual representation, is this art, or what is the artistic approach on nature, on life sciences, in difference to being merely a tool or being an illustration? So what is the difference between artistic approaches and kind of producing visual representation? So there must be more, I think.
That's a good question, because it's somehow, just to add, it's like, is it just about transporting knowledge, as you said, for example? No, but it's one main aspect you said. And what would you say? What is more about just transporting knowledge?
I sort of came of age, of scientific age, working in the laboratory of Alex Rich at MIT, who was a structural biologist. He resolved the ribosome and tRNA and things like that. And I find that's fascinating, you know, to bring the invisible level of not just cells but molecules into the kind of realm of human perception. But see, that isn't good enough. It's not good enough. You know, memory crystals, like Superman had memory crystals, the Klingons have memory crystals, Stargate, they have memory crystals, but see, crystals are uniform isometric repeats of the same thing over and over again, and if they're different, they're no longer crystals, right? So with Thomas Schwartz at MIT, we took Microvenous, which holds knowledge, and we grew a crystal of uniform, pure Microvenous. We did do several different versions of the Microvenous oligo to get one that worked, but we grew visible crystals of Microvenous, like to make the memory crystal, to make the dream come true. See, that's the difference. Science doesn't necessarily have to be poetic. It's often involuntarily poetic. But art, in my mind, always has to hold this special piece of the human soul that we consider to be poetic. And if it has scientific value, that's okay. But it has to be a kind of scientific value that can't be subtracted from the poetic part of it to begin with. It's otherwise I would just do pure research, and I wouldn't be allowed to do whatever I want to do, which is the coolest thing about my job.
Actually, if I could just make one more point, I wasn't actually trying to equate the illustration with art, but what I wanted to make more pertinent with that is that I think these illustrations very much shape how we think scientifically. I mean, I don't know if this is an apocryphal story, but wasn't PCR invented after like an acid trip or something like that, and this guy was visualizing?
Yeah. It is. I'm kind of indirectly acquainted with that guy.
Okay. Right, so let's not go there then.
And he's probably not the only one.
But I mean, so these let's not even call them artistic representations, but these illustrative representations completely shape the way scientists think about these natural processes, and you know, it feeds into the creative process there.
But I think we shouldn't go into black and white. So when we say bioart is something different than illustrating scientific knowledge, then we are doing that again what we have done previously. This is arts and this is science.
If you ask an illustrator whether they're artists or not, they will violently deny that they are artists.
Sure, but I read a fascinating book several years ago which was called The Art of Scientific Illustration. Yeah, so I think...
There's also the art of war.
Sure, but
war is an art.
Nevertheless, I think if you just illustrate something for me and I say I want to have it looking like this or that, yeah, then it's maybe just a service. But I think you need also some more than you need scientific knowledge, and you also need a certain way of creativity to make science better understandable to people. And I think this is an art or an artistic approach itself. Yeah, so I don't see it as a black, there's bioart, and white, there's science. Yeah, so I think there is a gray shade between science to arts. Yeah, and maybe the illustrators are more to the illustration science and the techniques that they use, but I think it's not black and white, it's a shade.
I think it's a learning process on both sides.
Yes, sure.
The first information keeping in DNA, which is also cited as the first bioart, was the Microvenous molecule. And in the 1980s, my scientific colleagues said, oh, well, this is a curiosity. It's like, I'll admit it's scientifically interesting, but it's never going to be scientifically relevant. And yet now it's been cited hundreds of times in the literature and spawned this whole new field in not only in the arts, but in science as well.
We got...
I don't know why I brought that up.
We get to people who wanted to say something. I think the first one was one of the artists, actually, Klaus, one of the weather dents. I think. Do you need a microphone?
So yeah, thanks. I mean, perhaps I'll just try to throw in some ideas here, try to, if we get any steps further. So from a goal orientation, for example, I would say that scientific illustrations and images, they want to reproduce something or make reproducibility possible in a way, because they need to be proven, and if they cannot be reproduced, in a sense, they will be changed. So there were different scientific images over time that changed because possibilities changed, and so these images changed. For example, how we would depict an atom. There are many different stages of complexity, and I would say of accessibility and of reproducibility. They make sense, but each one on a different level. And I would say artistic images, they don't want to make reproducibility possible, but they just want to make producibility possible. They just want to show what can be done and don't assume that it will be true or false in the future, but it will just stand next to other images, not in a hierarchy of truth, but it will be just all the same, so it's pretty much horizontal.
Don't forget about printmaking and serigraphy. They want to make reproductions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm as an image, I would, okay, let's put image away. Let's say just representation in an extreme basic sense. So each thing that is representing something else. It might be an image, might be text, might be music, might be whatever. So that, I would say, is one difference between science and art. So that I would say scientific images, that there is a vertical hierarchy of like truth, and in art it's pretty much horizontal. So if you look at a painting that is made 300 years ago and you look at a computer animation that is from yesterday, you wouldn't say either one is more true than the other one.
My favorite example is the scientist and the artist are sitting on the hill, and a cloud passes by, and the artist goes, my, that looks like a tree. And the scientist goes, well, in the first place, it's made out of water vapor, and it's 20,000 feet in the air. It can't possibly be a tree. One kind of underlying aspect of scientific inquiry is to how things can't be true. This can't be possible. All the ways something can't be true, whereas the kind of artistic approach is all about why something just might be true.
But am I allowed to raise a question? So in my understanding of BioArts, we have left this idea of representation, and this is the same with life sciences. We are not anymore in an era of representation of nature, but that turned at latest in the 1970s to a manipulation of nature. So representation is in some sense doing a transformative act or changing nature. And BioArts is not only about images, if I got it correctly, but for me it's primarily about working and manipulating living organism. And
Don't we manipulate nature when we build a sewer system or a dam?
Yes,
I mean,
of
we
course.
manipulate nature when we generate agricultural species of plants and animals that never existed before, and all of this has been going on. This kind of manipulation has been going on for millennia.
in some sense, yes. But the interesting question, of course, from a history of science or science studies perspective is, indeed, is this a kind of continuity in history, or is this a break? Is this something completely new dimension, what we are doing now, or what we are able to do? And if this would be the case, what is then this kind of bioartistic endeavor with that? So, and I would have other questions as well, but there was somebody else, and I I didn't want to interfere with that.
Maybe I can
To that
just
point,
comment
yeah.
on the question from the audience before. I agree with you, but we have left in science the area of just representing how it looks like. Yeah, when we look at complex data, the model. Yeah, but the data has become so complex that I cannot present it in graphs anymore. Yeah, so a heat map is probably not a kind of art. Yeah, but the idea how to translate representative findings into understandable messages. Yeah, this is for me a very new field in the communication sciences. Yeah, because you need a lot of creativity to translate these complex things we find in science today with omics data. Yeah, you have billions of data. You can't visualize it with graphs anymore. And even when I look at these papers in Nature, I don't understand it mostly, what is happening. And then I read it, I say, oh my God. Yeah, and I hope that someone is able to translate it to me better. And I think it's a very new field how to present scientific findings in an understandable way. It's not reprinting the findings, because the information is too complex for that.
It's interesting too, it's in terms of history of science, that in the 50s, late 50s, early 60s, they realized that the DNA codon has as much to do with the amino acid that it represents as like the word red has to do with the phenomena or perception of the color red, that what's going on there is going on according to the rules of natural language, which blew their minds. Then there was like all this big debate about comma-free code and comma code. Like they found, for the benefit of the audience, they found that the operation of the genetic code wasn't governed by a rule that you could mathematically figure out, but that there was this like sort of meta association with the shape and the charge and the substance of the DNA and the thing the DNA represented. It was like representing something with a word, and that just blew their minds. Scientists argued for a while about whether there were spaces between the words. And not all languages are written with spaces between the words. Classical Greek, for instance, was not written with spaces between the words, but we're like given to think about the world in terms of whatever we're used to, and we were used to spaces between the words.
Indeed, this was a very fascinating story, and maybe Lily Kay, maybe you know her work on this debate about the genetic code in the 1950s between the scientists and how they struggled to get into the code, and how it came that they realized that
it's amazing. You get to the edge of the universe, the greatest mystery that we've ever seen unfold, and there, imprinted on the wall, is the map of our own cerebral cortex.
As we are on the edge of the universe, I would say we can have a new question, finally.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I really enjoy it. It's hard to interrupt it, actually. But I was thinking about, because we were talking about the difference of arts and science, and for me it's like I always like to look out for the what brings it together, or at what point do they split, if they split. And for me it's creativity, so it's both needs it, and there's always the idea that that comes from this very not defined state, or like scientists are still trying to figure out what this is and why it is.
It's true, any hypothesis requires a creative moment, a great notion, right? So maybe there should be a kind of altar of Vitruvius where scientists have to learn a little bit about their poetic souls in order
Definitely.
to be perfect masters.
If I may add something to that, because I agree with you entirely, and I think it should, perhaps even by scientists themselves, be recognized more widely that science is a creative process. In essence, we are creating the new reality. We are doing experiments.
It's 50
we are
kilometers
not
away.
Finding the truth. Sorry?
It's 50 kilometers away.
Yeah, yes, we used to create the reality about, half a millisecond ago. But now I've lost my train of thought. Thank you very much. Yes, we are not, I'm adamant that as scientists we're not creating truth. We are creating our explanations, our ideas. We're projecting our ideas onto the world in the same way that artists do.
And I think it's also kind of like scientists need to know that they are just like one representation of reality, because there are so many models coming from like one perspective. I think Ms. Brandt said it before also, that it's just like we have, it's just a perspective, and we can't assume that it works for everyone or every living organism. It's just our state of truth or something.
Science is knowledge. It's not, I mean, someone may argue that science is just an opinion that's of the moment, but it's knowledge, and it's the best knowledge we have, and it doesn't do any of us any good to deny that. And artists and others often deny that.
Which leads
Sadly.
me to another question or you had actually. I really liked that question, and also like a question to you all, and all, especially the artists. Is there something like an artistic fact? Because this is what you ask.
Could be a contradiction in itself, isn't it?
I don't know. Maybe what would
Facts
you say?
have strange companions.
Yeah, thank you very much so far from me too. And yeah, I thought this is one of the most intriguing questions. I think there's maybe something like an artistic fact, but the interesting thing about it, compared to like scientific facts, is that you can't really grasp it, and that's actually the good thing about it, because it's always fluid and contingent, and in this way you can maybe communicate. You spoke about communication, things that can't yet be scientifically described, and therefore art is very necessary. I'm a social scientist, so I think maybe it's even more important, not more important, but like everything's debated, and all the bases of social sciences are always debated, like since the rejection of behavioralism. And yeah, I think art has some way to communicate, like something like divinity, that can't be made with scientific facts.
I think there may be something like an artistic fact. There are clinical facts, right? Demonstrable, empirical facts. Facts that you can displace so much water with so much mass, and these kind of facts. But there's a kind of ideas can be facts too, right? The things we hold in our heart, the things we believe, it's not, I mean, we might call them supernatural, but really they're part of reality too. They're part of the human experience, and therefore they must exist. There must be some kind of, even if they're not empirical, they kind of share reality with us. They're facts.
Yes, maybe I had a question on this, because for me it turned from a kind of artistic fact into something which, for me at least, sounded a little bit spiritual or even metaphysical when listening to your lecture. I was not sure about this dimension, and I could not really. And of course, for me, this would be a major difference between bioartistic approaches and scientific approaches.
Hopefully, nobody will ever be able to pull them apart.
Sorry?
Hopefully, nobody, in this case, hopefully no one will ever be able to pull it apart, to say this is only scientific, even though it represents scientific value. It is the densest, most highest information density today. But it is something else. It's something about that's more intrinsically human than Yeah. It is science and it is poetic. And that's really important. It's like one of those Chinese finger puzzles. If you were able to pull it apart, then the facts would be trivial on either side.
Maybe just a comment to the question from the audience. I'm somewhat surprised. Do you really think that science consists or describes only facts? So at least in my field, we are discussing facts every year again and find out it's not a fact. We do not know. That's why we do another study. Yeah. So most of the things in science.
Donald Trump.
Yeah, yeah. But we are communicating a lot of things in science as these are facts. And if you look at textbooks, it sounds like, okay, this is known, this is known, this is known, but this is a translation of the scientific knowledge, which is a bit simplified. In some cases, it's more reliable or it's more a fact, like in other areas. But for example, in my field, we do not know, yeah, when we talk about animal fat, for example, there's a lively discussion, is it harmful or not? We do not know exactly. Yeah, because we have studies who showed, yes, it is. We have studies, yes, it is not. Yeah, and in many disciplines in science, we are living in a changing area where I'm going a bit more in this direction or in this, and I try to prove my opinion on this finding because we don't have a real fact. We have an opinion, an expert opinion on it. And in many fields of life sciences, maybe different than in physics, and as far as I learned, even in physics.
So we don't have facts, we have metaphors.
Yeah, but that it is. And we have in many fields just an expert consensus, yeah, which has been made by many experts, and not all agree to the interpretation of the data.
There's some languages like that. I think there's a fantastical language on Star Trek about this species that only talked by saying two things, and then the truth was the thing they were trying to say was that
the opposite.
It was the commonality between those two things. But the language of the Aztecs, the Nahuatl language, works like that. You never say what it is exactly what you're after, but you say it by saying the two things around it. And so if Aztec science developed, it would be a science of metaphorical facts, right? Yeah. Language is cool.
There's a question.
My question first, I got lost because of the answers, but I'm going to try to ask the question. The question I want to ask is actually, Joe, in your presentation, there is the relationship between Islam and the fact of the whole Islam background and the Hallelujah. But this, I want to ask it from a perspective of now the discussion about whether art and science, or the science of art, or this relationship. If we assume an artist like you, who is using science like as an instrument to express your scientific approach of life. I mean, you're not creating a fact, you're describing, demonstrating all the different elements of senses. From that perspective of the creative side of an artist, explaining nature, and the privilege of being an artist to cross the border of a culture, a taboo zone. As she said, science has its own culture background. Which taboo zone do you want to cross?
Which?
The taboo zone of today, which you want to cross. What is the emotional background for you to connect the Islam expression of hallelujahs and your creation of angel?
Mm.
Or is there?
There's something very fascinating for me about revealing paradoxes that fly all around us all the time. That is almost always inherently poetic. This revelation of the paradox, what sits in front of our nose that we never saw. Like, we transmitted pictures of man and Barbie doll into space, and nobody noticed the missing genitalia for like 20 years. And the aliens come down and abduct us to experiment with our sex organs, and we wonder why. Like, it's... The paradox is always something brilliant and enlightening. It's something that... it's like, that's my exploration, you know.
So the paradox is the fascination for the art.
It's always, it always
for
makes
this
life,
specific art.
to recognize the paradox always makes life richer. It's like I hunt paradoxes like I hunt fossils. It's like a mining operation.
Can I say something about paradoxes? Because it seems to me, when we're talking about science and art, for me this is an artificial paradoxalization of these two items. And the question to you would be, is art even possible without technology? Isn't art completely dependent? The first caveman taking a bit of coal, writing something, how are we deciding that is art instead of him saying that is my scientific representation of a herd of cows and communicating when they're passing here for hunting? Maybe that was a scientific paper of the day.
Well, there's always poets and a cappella singers.
That's a point.
True. But then, so is music not a technology? Is language not a technology? Is that not paradoxical?
I guess I've never really think about language as technology, but I
You code with it?
Yes. But I don't really think about it as, but you're right, it is.
I mean,
and it's a learned thing.
A symphony orchestra is a technological advancement of epic proportions. And yeah. So for me, art, it cannot exist without technology, unless somebody in the room is wanting to prove me wrong.
When I played the trumpet, it really annoys the neighbors.
What do you mean art cannot exist without technology?
Well, prove me wrong.
Yes. I mean, technology would enable for an artist to express the diversity of itself. But if you mean technology in a very small sense, it means, okay, then what do you mean technology then?
Well, I've just mentioned that I consider language and music technologies. Okay. That's not a small sense, is it?
Yeah, no, it is not. Okay.
Well, you can even make art with the nature, for example. So
yes, and then you take an object and you make something with it. That's a tool. That is technology.
Okay, so maybe we should define technology, but I think we had another question, wasn't it?
It was less of a question and more of a comment to the question before about if there are facts, or if art is a fact. And I'm one of the artists in the program as well, and I would say that's the whole point of art for there to not really be a fact, because I think, there are parts of an artwork that are fact, the material you use, the amount of time the video is, those are facts. The places you go to make the work is a fact. But what makes an artwork is to have a viewer. And when you bring in people from different backgrounds and different cultures, they will mirror themselves in the work itself, meaning that it can be a fact, it could be millions of facts for millions of different people. Yeah, that was my comment on that before.
Sorry, Ms. Huthoff, I think I interrupted you 1 minute ago. Yeah, okay. Are there any more questions or comments or answers, maybe?
Yeah. Hello. I like this idea of art and technology. I guess we would have to define what technology is. I come from a background where I try to disprove statements, so I would say, do you consider dancing technology with muscles?
I suppose I would in the same way as I would language. It is certainly a technique. I'm a dancer, actually. I take technique classes for tango. There is technique there, and so where there's technique, I suppose there's technology.
Of course, you could be speaking the tongues, and it wouldn't be technology.
Okay. Thank you.
Then it would be psychopathology.
Anyhow, if I'm allowed to add one aspect on this, so I'm not sure from a philosophical perspective, of course we could equate art, technology, religion, science, everything as a specific way of a human approach to world. And then of course we have a very analogous situation with art and technology. But I can agree with that. This would be argued by Cassira, for example, or so. But I would be careful to reduce technology only to a tool. So, and technology would be something then which is really much more than it's an approach to how we access the world and how we not only make the world, but also how we understand ourselves in this world. And maybe there is indeed a parallel with art on this more abstract level, not only on being a tool.
The cell phone is a great tool for communications, but it also causes a lot of traffic accidents. So it has a societal impact besides communication. Right.
I had to, I'm sorry.
Working? Yeah. A little confused because are we even separating technology and art or nature? Because for me it just sounded like no, because if music or language is technology, which I see the point of it, but then if we, for example, we look at nature and we find it beautiful, it is also some kind of art, but then we would say the looking at, like the having a viewer makes it art. And by having a viewer, we also already have the working of the neurons in the eyes and everything. And so this would be technology as well, and then we cannot separate it anymore.
But, you know, physics already tells us that by observing things, we change it.
So if you had an art collection and you put it in a museum with no windows and no doors, would it stop being art?
But I think the idea was that when you create something in art, that means you have used a tool. And just depending on the state of technology, a piece of coal is a tool for painting.
Or indeed a body movement or a sound. It is a tool for
sure.
conveying information.
So I think this was the idea that you just use a tool, and a tool is from a certain point of view is a technology.
Precisely.
Some of us are better clarinet players than others.
But they use the same piano, huh?
Yes, okay. So, scientist speaking here. And I wanted to throw in a completely new word into this discussion, which is emotion. And maybe coming back also to this perspective or like reproducibility. So from a scientist perspective, I would say that science seems to get out the emotions. Yeah,
really?
This is what the provocative sentence, whereas art rather probably tries to represent or to show emotions. So maybe scientists can say something else now.
I think we have to, just to say, some people in Jena think microbiology is the most important piece of science in the world. And from my point of view, it isn't. Yeah, but it's science, and we can discuss it, and we can find arguments for it, and we have data for it. But science, at least, should avoid emotions, but it's full of emotions.
Maybe I have
so at least in our field, I have colleagues who have a completely opposite opinion than mine. And it's always a very heavily emotional discussion about scientific facts. Sorry?
Fights at the wet bench.
Yeah.
Maybe I have to be more precise, not in the passion of conducting science itself, but rather in the analyzation of my data. So I don't, because I love that caterpillar so much, I wanted to, I don't know, win against the other one. So this kind of emotion, like not interpreting too much into data, but looking at it from a very cool, chilled way. And this is maybe much more of a difference to art.
But I've chosen this, yeah.
I was just saying, it should be clear that since time immemorial, artists have tried to provoke emotion, right? It's like, I guess, in some fields of pharmacology, there's also an effort to scientifically provoke emotions of one sort or the other. But these are really different approaches to that problem.
But I think, once again, in life sciences, we don't talk about facts. We interpret data. And there are different views how to interpret the data. And we have really areas in life sciences where we have people who have contradictory opinions. And they all use the same data. Yeah, and we, at least in life sciences, for example, when you look at cohort studies, large-scale studies, you're doing 10 studies, you can do a use a statistic approach to get findings from it. And sometimes you have findings in some studies which are like, oh, it's more evidence or less evidence. And this is heavily discussed. So interpretation of data means that you bring in your own opinion, your own knowledge, and this can lead to contradictory opinions. And this is why I said before, science is not talking about facts.
That's why I bring my gun.
Yeah. So I really know areas where I have, when we had a podium discussion like this about nutrition, yeah, about animal fat, yeah, and you can find different views, and it's a very lively discussion. Yeah.
So yeah, I think nowadays also science is very much inclined in emotions, and I think like when we look 100 years ago, then perhaps there was this wish of science to produce like real facts that are 100% sure, but during the course of the last 100 years, it turned out that it's not possible to achieve like 100% truth. So even mathematics turned out to be shaky on the grounds. You know, there were people that tried to prove everything, and they failed. And so there was kind of the consciousness in science shifted towards more artistic practices, I would say, because people and scientists acknowledge that you can't have 100% truth, so you have to live with some sort of uncertainties. You have to kind of deal with these uncertainties, and so, in my opinion, science actually turned into a more artistic direction because science couldn't prove its base. It couldn't prove itself to be 100% sure, and that's why also I think that's why I think scientists also are coming closer to artists, because art always embraced these uncertainties. It always acknowledged them, it played with them, it turned them into emotion or into many other practices, and now science actually has to do the same. Science was a little bit betrayed by the fact that there are no truths, and so it had to kind of find another identity, and for me this identity lies a little bit in the arts because of those unruly grounds there.
May I say something? Because I have an opinion on almost everything, but definitely on that, because I don't agree that science does not embrace uncertainty. as scientists, we must embrace uncertainty. I think what we do is the process of eliminating the uncertainties. For instance, when scientists say, I'm proving something, that's when the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I'm very much somebody who advocates the philosophy of Popper, that we do things by refutation. We study and we can rule out the falsehoods. So,
all the reasons something can't be true.
yes, right. So, in that sense, as a scientist, I'm fully aware of the uncertainties. I'm just trying to pick out the ones that are the low-hanging fruit that we can do away with. I'm not naive to think that I'm going to arrive at the truth at the end, but at least I can do away with the rubbish ideas. And for me, that is embracing of uncertainty.
I appreciate all your efforts.
You know, I would just like to add that I would also wildly disagree, actually, because I think, you know, and I would definitely agree with you. So I think science is about dealing with uncertainties forever. Actually, there's a famous story of Schrödinger, you know, famous quantum physicist, one of the godfathers of physics, if you will, and he gave legendary lessons, actually, in the 40s, I believe. And I think, you know, the name of the first series was What is Life, right? So like big questions, right? You know, which inspired actually many of the biologists, you know, that came up with great discoveries in the 20th century. Now, the next series was actually, because he found it hard actually to find an answer, right? It was uncertain. You know, he didn't have the means actually to address these questions with the, you know, with the thought model that was available at that time. So the next series of questions that was raised in the next series of lectures was what is a law of nature, right? So a more fundamental one, right? Didn't come to a conclusion, right? And so the third one and the last one, and this is sort of like, I mean, I think pure despair, right? Was actually the nature and the Greeks, right? And that was it, right? So so basically, I mean, Schrödinger, what it describes is basically that a great mind that found many certainties along the way, who came up with a equation that helped later generations to find solutions to fundamental problems and raise many new questions, by the way. He also actually concluded that there is a question that he just couldn't address at the time, right? And I think this happens to us all the time. And so I think in a way this is probably where the boundary is between science and arts, I guess, right? You know, we basically deal with the same fundamental questions, you know, something that really addresses us all. And if there is a difference, then it's maybe the difference in the eye of the beholder, right? So like, you know, when Haeckel was painting his famous diatomea, right? He was actually trying to depict, I mean, basically to illustrate an observation that he made, right? So you would say he was illustrating something. However, the name of that work, right, is Kunstformen der Natur, right? So it's like the artistic forms of nature. And today, I think everybody agrees that what he created was actually art, right? And I think that's quite interesting. So it became art because we all believe that it is art, right? And I think that's probably an important aspect of art, isn't it?
This thing about uncertainty is a classical scientific problem. I mean, historically, Gödel's uncertainty theorem, you know, some facts are simply not provable, like this is a lie.
I think this is also one thing that artists and scientists really have in common, which is failure. And these attempts, you know, as an artist, you're in the studio until 2 in the morning, you spend spending months on a work, and then you finish and you look at it and you're like, God, I hate this. And you never show it or anything. And I think from a scientist's perspective, you probably experience these moments on a different level, but also very often.
Art sucks, I hate it.
And then it's, you know, waking up the next day and then trying again or doing a different attempt or
really?
finding a new idea where you can, yeah. It could be interesting maybe if the scientists give their perspective on failure a bit. I would find it interesting.
Maybe directly to this?
Maybe to that before, since we have touched so much on all these very different aspects of the history of science and the relation of arts and science within history. And I could start to tell a lot, but then there's the danger that I will not stop. So I want to return to my beginning with Fleck. And if there is something we can learn from Fleck, with this idea of a scientific fact, Tatsache, is that he challenged, of course, this naive view of there is such a thing as like the scientific truth, but even more to think about thought styles and thought collectives means that we should be careful and avoid speaking about the science, and we did it all the last 5 minutes, the science and the arts. So there is no the science as there is no the arts or the arts. There is a plurality of very different approaches, even within science. And with respect to these more philosophical questions about how scientific approaches deal with uncertainties, in history we have to differentiate between very different branches within this scientific field. Even within life sciences, there was not such an idea of the biology in the early 20th century. There was zoology, botany, there were biophysics, biochemistry. And speaking with Fleck, these were different thought collectives, Denkkollektive, with different thought styles. And they had even different ideas of the meaning of scientific concepts. We could start with the gene concept, whatever, in biology. There were very different approaches on how to understand this. So, and so we should really be careful to speak about the sciences. If we think about very specific approaches like we started with molecular biology, gene technologies, and so this is not representative for the science.
I don't know about in the European academic system, maybe it's not the same, but in all of the laboratories I've been affiliated with, they're not uniformly one discipline. Like our lab has MDs, has biophysics, has chemists, you know, there are all these sort of sub-disciplines, and each one of them has its own kind of micro-vernacular, but we teach each other the micro-vernaculars, and we even have an ethicist.
Like an orchestra almost.
Sort of, yeah. Basso profundo, soprano.
So yeah, perhaps I can just respond also to you two. I mean, I totally agree with you. Perhaps you understood me wrong because I was talking about the sciences 100 years ago. So for me, Schrödinger and everybody who's sitting here, you're already of the new generation of scientists. I was talking about the science, like for example, physics, not talking about science being more specific. Physics, for example, as Newton imagined it. When Newton imagined physics, there were certainties. Everything had a place. There was a kind of a fixed space around everything. But this space kind of broke apart. So, and uncertainties were introduced into physics, for example. I would say the metaphysics were introduced into physics, and that's where all the struggle and the thinking changed. So I would totally agree with everything you say. I would just say, go 50 years back from Schrödinger and ask yourself how was looking physics back then. Were there uncertainties? Were people talking about uncertainties, like real metaphysical uncertainties? Or was it just, okay, our instruments are not precise enough?
But you know what, I think that is a back-projected view of Newton. Newton was also an alchemist, interested in mysticism and that kind of stuff, so you know, he wasn't the guy that you are now making out to be. So.
But isn't always like that? This is always so I mean, why do we? Yeah, and I think there's nothing wrong about it, right? So I mean, you know, you can, I mean, like, you know, there's always this sort of theoretical view on someone based on the basically the contribution that was made, and then of course there's the real personality with all its like individual uncertainties, which sort of in a way make it interesting actually to look at the history of sciences from a biographical point of view, right? I mean, Hans Berger, who invented the EEG, was actually, I mean, he was terribly esoteric, right? And the reason why he got into this field was because he wanted to prove that there is a magic wave that allows for telepathy, right? So, and I think the driving forces, right, can be very diverse, right? And I think that's absolutely okay. They have to be, right? And I don't even see there is actually a contradiction. I think, and I think this is what, Joe is not there anymore, so we can praise him. I think I think, what his point really is, and I know him now for almost 20 years, which is crazy long, is that, this sort of like, similarities and connectivities in all of us as human beings, right? So the way we think, right, makes us actually close to each other and makes us able to communicate with each other, have actually this sort of decent discussion that we're having today, right? And then I think that's why I think whether there is an artist's perception or a scientific perception shouldn't really matter actually, right? So I would say we are very close, and it's just the audience that actually makes the difference. And of course there is a fundamental, I would say, the difference in the approach that we take, right? So as an artist, you are free actually to forget about the facts for a moment and actually to sort of like, enjoy the angels, right? Whereas, you guys, you poor scientists, we poor scientists, if I might call myself a scientist as well, we would probably not seriously do that, at the conferences that we attend, right? Because this would be considered too esoteric or too spiritual. But that's it. If you sort of remove that sort of curtain of divinity or religion or whatever, right? Then you will find out that we are all very similar.
We're getting presents. So I would say,
this is for us. The angels.
It's a DNA from the two. Do we have more?
No, well, I could meet you with some more, but I only brought 4.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I would say this is like the end of the discussion right now. But we can. That's very nice. Thank you.
My collaborator Sarah Khan says in Islam my collaborator Sarah Khan says that in Islam there are 2 different kinds of angels. They're always following us around. One of them records all the bad things, and one of them records all the good deeds and such, and we just have to keep the good one busy, right? Right.
That's nice. We can, if you have any more questions, you can ask them.
Go to the bar.
There's a bar, there's beer, and I would just say, well, I really like the last points we made in this really decent discussion, as you also said. Yeah, but you just missed 1 minute. But I would just say, let's stay uncertain. I would say this is very important. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here, all of you. Thank you for asking so many questions, for being such a good discussion partner team here. And let's have a beer, I would say.